Good. Okay, so in-season conditioning, how to develop your engine in season and actually get fitter, more conditioned so that you can improve your performance on the pitch because conditioning is such a vital component, especially for field athletes like footballers who are tracking up to around 10K per game. So it's important that we are well conditioned to meet the demands on the pitch. Okay, so there's a few things that we need to cover today in order to do so. So whenever it comes to conditioning, there's three main blocks that you need to focus on. Okay. First block is your phosphagen system. Next is your glycogen lactic acid system. And then you have your aerobic system. And these all play a different role whenever it comes to the intensity of your conditioning, whenever you're playing your sport. So I'm not going to spend too much time going into too much scientific detail here, but I'm going to try and explain it as simple as possible. So here is your phosphagen system, which runs off something called ATP. Now, ATP isn't highly available because it's used at such high intensities. And where you'll find when you use ATP most is when you are sprinting, whenever you're hitting your max speed over a short period of time. And this can't last. You know yourself, whenever you go to run a sprint, after about 8 to 10 seconds, the speed starts to drop off because you can't hold that due to lack of ATP in your system. So that only lasts for about 10 seconds. Next up, we have our glycogen lactic acid system, which runs primarily on glycogen, okay? And this can last up to around 3 minutes in total. This is where you'll probably see it if I was to give you an example of, think of a swimmer, for example, swimming 400 meters in the pool. So this is going to be high intensive, 3 minutes, and then that's going to start to drop off, okay? And then finally, you'll have your marathon runner who uses the aerobic respiratory, which runs primarily on fats and oxygen. Okay, so they're highly available within the body, so they can be used over a very long period of time. We're talking hours here. Okay, but in regards to the other two, that's when it's not as available, and you need to allow for recovery to replenish those stores. Okay. So here on the chart is a good example of a chart of how these energy systems work whenever we're using them. So as you can see, the ATP system that we talked about, the phosphagen system, lasts about 10 seconds and then it drops off. From here, we will drop into that lactic system, okay? So we'll start to move into this area here and start to move into using that system. And that can last up to about 3 minutes. From here, you'll start to cross over into your aerobic system, which is the one that you can use for hours. It's the one that uses oxygen and fats and is highly available, okay? But like on a football pitch, you're not going to be able to just jog around at low intensities. Where you're going to spend most of your time, where you want to spend most of your time, is here and here, because that's going to give you the biggest benefit on the pitch, okay? But this is where a lot of players get things wrong whenever it comes to training their conditioning and improving their conditioning for the pitch. What a lot of players will do in season is focus a lot on this. So they'll do a lot of doggy runs, shuttle runs, intervals, stuff like that, because that's what you need to be fit in the pitch. That's what you do in the pitch, isn't it? But the thing with that is, in your team training and in your games, you get so much of this already. Like, so what you want to really focus on is getting more of this, your aerobic, and the ATP in. Okay, you're already getting plenty of this. So what you need to do is focus on building up the other areas, because not one system is at use by itself. They all are in use in each other. So they all blend and work off each other. Okay. So the stronger you are in one system, the stronger you're going to be in others. Okay. So that's why it's important to have a good balanced training program that trains all three. But what you will find is at any given time, you will be more dominant in one. Okay, so you'll be more dominant in ATP if you go for a 20-meter sprint, you'll be more dominant whenever that runs out, you go into lactic, and then the aerobic can be more dominant whenever you're tracking back, you're getting into position and stuff like that. So I'm going to take you through different ways that you can train these systems in season and how it actually looks to train them. So firstly, number one, which I think is probably the most overlooked of every conditioning piece, and it is developing your aerobic capacity. So your aerobic capacity is your base. It's your base for cardiovascular strength and health, and it is vital if you want to recover quicker, have higher power output, and be able to go for longer on the pitch. So it's important that we don't neglect this and we actually train it. And not a lot of people train it right. So I'm going to take you through how to train it right now. So what you want to do when it comes to zone 2 training, which is how you train this base, is you want to continuously train between 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. Okay, so you don't want your heart rate to go over 70, because then you start to, I'll just take you back a wee second. Once you go over like 70% of your max heart rate, you start to pull into this lactic, which is not what we want to train. We want to stay here and train this efficiently. So you want to keep your heart rate between 60 and 70% of your max heart rate. But if you don't have like a heart rate monitor, a Whoop band, an Apple Watch that can track your heart rate whenever you're training, then just go off an RPE, which stands for rate of preserved exertion. So basically how hard you feel the exercise is out of 10. And I would keep that between a 6.5 to 7 out of 10. You'll be more dominant regardless in that aerobic. As long as you're not pushing yourself and you think that you have to beat out an extra, like, couple of intervals at the end of your zone 2 training, which a lot of guys do. You don't have to do that. That's what you should focus on. And how do you actually train it? What's a good example of doing zone 2 based training? So, for example, what you could do is you could grab a bike erg, any sort of spin bike, something like that, jump on it for 30 minutes and just keep your heart rate below 70%. Just nice and casual. This isn't going to be too taxing, okay? It's not going to leave you wrecked. It's not going to leave you feeling sore. It's just nice and easy, and it's just doing that boring base work that can really have massive gains for you in your season, okay? So throwing in one of these a week on top of your strength training can be massive and can have a big return. And then how you just train that and progressively overload it is just add a wee bit more in over time. So instead of doing, you could maybe start off doing 15 minutes, move it to 20, move it to 25, and so on, okay? And number 2 is developing anaerobic capacity. So 80 to 90% of your max heart rate lasts between 3 minutes. We've already covered this, but as I said, you already get so much of this in your training and games. Okay, so it's not something that we really need to focus highly on. But if you do want to throw it in, maybe in like a top-up session, if you don't have a game at the weekend, then here is an example of a session or an exercise that you could do to train your anaerobic capacity. So grab a rowing machine, do an EMOM for 10 minutes, 100-meter row, rest the remainder of the minute. So how an EMOM works basically is every minute on the minute, you will sprint 100 meters. So you'll have a timer there. Once you start that timer, you hit 100 meters on the row as quick as you can. And whatever is left of that minute, when you finish, you rest. And once you hit 1 minute, you go again. Once you hit 2 minutes, you go again. And you do that every minute on the minute for 10 minutes. So it'll be 10 rounds, and it will feel like your legs, your lungs, everything will be on fire. But that's just that lactic buildup in the body, that uncomfortable feeling. That's just down to our body not being able to get enough oxygen around to actually use that lactic acid for energy and stuff like that. So yeah, that's how you would go about doing an anaerobic training session. I hope this makes sense so far. If there's anything that's tripping you guys up, let me know in the comments and I'll cover it at the end. So finally, moving on to another very underlooked part of the conditioning, and it's developing your ATP system, okay? Developing your speed. So this is max intent effort. This is when you are fresh and you can just send it for 10 seconds, whether it be a sprint, heavy lift, anything like that. Lasts around 10 seconds. You'll not get any more out of it really than 10, 11 seconds. An example of this would be sprinting or doing like a 1 RM lift or 3 RM lift, something very intensive in a short period of time. And it's important that we train this as well. There's a lot of benefits to doing like sprint training in the middle of your season to keep your hamstrings happy and healthy so that you don't end up with lower limb injuries. You can actually develop and keep your speed high throughout the season from doing this as well. So I highly recommend having some sort of sprint work in your program in season. And on top of it, you're going to be better conditioned for it because you're training that ATP system also. Right, an example of a session, something that I would program for athletes whenever they're in season that work with me, or sprint training, doing some flies, doing just some dead start sprints, 2 times 50 meters, 2 times 60 meters, just set that out in the pitch, maybe just setting out where you run from the byline to the halfway line as quick as possible. That could be your sprint zone. And then you rest 1 minute per, really in an ideal world, you'll rest 1 minute for every 10 meters you sprint. So like this is how clear I want you to be on your recovery and how fresh I want you to be for this. So if you sprinted 50 meters, you would take a 5-minute rest. Like that's a long time. And the reason we do that is because we want to recuperate as much ATP as possible before we go again. Because if you don't, you're not going to be training that system. You're going to start diving into endurance, your lactic based system, and that's not what we want. We want to be fresh and we want to be fully recovered so that we can train that ATP system. It's very important that we do that. It's don't go out and just sprint, walk back, sprint, walk back, because it will very quickly move from an ATP based session to an glycogen lactic system. Hope that all makes sense so far. I think I've done this slide twice. 1 second. Yeah, so basically that's it. Like, for a recap, focus on what you aren't getting. So you're already getting so much of that lactic-based energy system, and you need to focus more on the ATP and the zone 2 because you're not getting enough of that from your training, from your team training and your game. So it's important that you're topping up those systems to keep everything well balanced and to improve that overall conditioning. We use all 3 systems at any stage, at any moment, but you're going to be more dominant in one depending on how intensive or how recovered you are at that stage. Focus on training each system specifically, as I kind of covered there in the last slide. When it comes to sprinting, make sure you're fully recovered so you have a good source of ATP. Even if it's the aerobic, make sure that you're not raising your heart rate too high so you're moving into the lactic. Make sure that you're training that specific zone when you're training it. We want to be as specific as possible whenever we're training these zones. And finally, improve your ability to perform optimally for longer. Well, that just comes from improving your conditioning. A very probably underlooked and underutilized strategy for keeping performance high in season, keeping your recovery better, and like just overall improving your performance. Because as I covered at the start, the amount of ground footballers cover in a game nowadays is crazy. So you need to be a well-conditioned athlete if you want to compete. Like minimum, I'm seeing players hit between 10K to 12K in a game. Like that's a lot of ground to be covered, and that's not done nice and easy in that aerobic state. Like going out and running 10K is hard enough. Just think in a game, you're sprinting, you're up and down over 90 minutes. There's a lot of ground covered in a quick period of time. So it's important that you're doing this, or you're just going to be left behind. You're going to fall behind. You're not going to be able to keep up with your opponent, and you're going to really struggle. So if you want to get the edge in your opponent, look at improving your conditioning whilst in season, because a lot of these players aren't doing this stuff. So it's very easy to get ahead. So hopefully that was helpful, guys. I'm going to stop the recording here and then I'll take some questions.